Hi everyone, welcome back to Literature Analysis Walkthrough. This is our second video in the series of 6, and today we're going to talk about the introduction. A lot of students are afraid of the introduction, mostly because they don't quite know what they're expected to put in it. They know they need a thesis. I'm leaving that for another video. They know that they need some kind of hook. Now, I don't like the word hook because it sounds like you're trying to sell something, and you're not trying to sell something. You're trying to set up the context for your thesis. That's what your hook is doing. I call it a lead-in. So they're very often told, these two middle sections, by the way, are the easy parts. The tag, your teachers might have used the word tag. It's the title, author, genre. They identify the work you will discuss. I mean, that's kind of common sense. Again, as I said in the last video, your talents with writing will determine whether or not you do this middle part elegantly, but it's fairly simple that you know you have to put it in there somewhere. Stay with this video. I've got 4 different models of really well-written introductions. They're short, they're snappy, they got all this stuff, and they'll give you some structural devices that you can use to include your tag and your synopsis. Synopsis you don't always need. Sometimes the tag is enough, but it's another identifier that helps the reader know a little bit more about the work that you're going to talk about, if that's necessary. If in your tag you say, you know, Shakespeare's tragedy Macbeth, you probably don't need a synopsis. The word tragedy is enough. Anyway, so again, your mastery of language and what you feel is necessary for the reader will determine whether or not you have to actually include a synopsis. You'll see some examples here. Okay, well, let's dig into the lead-in. That's the hard part. I've said this before in a previous video, but I think it's worth repeating. Writers don't write from their own minds. They write from a collective mind. They write from the past. All writers have read lots of writing, and they've borrowed and stolen all of the structures that they've read. They find their way into their own mind. It's the same with any of the art forms, and it's the same with sports. You study the masters of the past and you incorporate their ideas into your ideas. Well, this is also true for something as kind of simple as a high school or university literature paper. There are systems, there are strategies that writers use to lead into their thesis, and these are 6 of the most common ones. By the way, these are not only useful for literary essays, they're useful for lots of other essay types as well. Popular opinion and disagree, missing perspective, problem and solution, background information, define your terms, and approach. So I'm going to address these one by one now. Popular opinion, then disagree. This is the most important opening strategy that you will ever learn for all of your essays and your debates. If you ever had a debate, you know that you have to imagine what your enemy is going to say to you. If you can't imagine what your enemy is going to say, then you've already lost the debate. It's the same kind of thing when you're doing your writing, in all kinds of writing. This is not a debate, of course, and we're not trying to be nasty. We're not trying to defeat or destroy our enemies or anything like that. But you're trying to tap into what everybody's already thinking about a text. We know that this is all true. We've watched Macbeth. We've studied it. We know that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are feeling guilty, and that they are guilty because they've murdered a good man. So fair enough. We all know that. Your next step is to say, hey, we're all in agreement here, correct? Now I'd like you to consider my thesis, and that's where your thesis comes in. So let's just read through this and then we'll move on. What's the easiest, most obvious reading of the text? Start your essay with a lazy perspective. And I use the word lazy kind of jokingly here. It's just the most obvious. Then you proceed to demonstrate why it's lazy. This will challenge the reader and pique their interest. So all your readers and all your audience are kind of nodding, yeah, I agree with that, I agree with that. And then you say, but what about this? Now that gets their interest. It will also make you look like the more thoughtful and sophisticated thinker. Absolutely. You're providing context to the situation, to the play, or to your thesis. And then you're saying, I'm going to go as deep as I can possibly go. You might have all thought that this was the case, but hey, there's another element that you're not considering, which leads us to one of the future ones as well. So missing perspective and problem solution are very closely connected to popular opinion and disagree. It's the joining of the conversation. We've been talking about Macbeth for the last 2 weeks in class, and everybody seems to be saying A, B, and C. Nobody's been saying D, however, and I've been thinking a lot about D. What do you guys think about D? It's the same approach you should have. It's a mental attitude. It's the mental attitude you should have for all of your academic writing in literature class or in history class or whatever. It's what are people saying and what are people not saying. The stuff that they are not saying is what you should be saying, because that's where new information might occur, might be found. What perspective is missing from the debate, and what do you have to offer? Agree with other perspectives, then point out what's missing. Now, this agreement is very important, very, very important. It's civil. Your debates about academic matters and all matters, political matters or whatever, should be civil. It's like, okay, well, you guys have been saying A, B, and C, and I see some value in that. I don't really like C that much, but A and B aren't bad. What do you guys think of D? That's the kind of attitude you should have when you're engaging with other minds in the academy, when you're in school. That's what we should be doing. We should be wrestling with ideas. Have that attitude when you start writing your paper. Problem solution. The problem. But that's all. It's all about problems. When you're discussing literature, it's all about problems. You read an Emily Dickinson poem. She's not an easy poet. You've been talking about a particular image for the last 45 minutes. It's a problem. It's a real problem, and you don't have a solution yet. Well, you go home that night and you have to write an essay about the poem. So you're rolling the problem around in your mind, and hopefully you're coming up with some kind of solution, because that's your job, is to come up with solutions to those kinds of literary problems. Why did Hamlet do X? Why didn't Hamlet do X? What does the image of the flower stand for? Those are all problems, and you should be fleshing those out in your writing. That's what you're writing all about. So set that up at the beginning of your introduction. That's your lead-in. Background information, define your terms and approach are all closely related. They're providing context for your reader or your listener if you're giving some kind of debate or a speech. Speech writing is very, very similar to essay writing. It's almost the same thing, actually. Background information will become very obvious to you and easily understandable if you just think of your own conversations. If you've ever had a conversation with a friend or a family member and they all of a sudden randomly start talking about rabbits or something like that, and you're wondering where the hell that came from, you'll know when background information is required, because it just came out of the blue, and we don't know why. So then you have to ask, well, why are you talking about rabbits? And the guy says, well, I saw a movie and it was really sad or whatever. And so, okay, now you're ready. Now you're all ready to proceed because you're all on the same page. We know what we're talking about. So for your literature, if, for example, you're writing an essay on a cyberpunk novel or something like that, we may need to know what cyberpunk means. You may need to explain some background about cyberpunk and the historical background. For example, it's a genre that began in the mid 1980s. A lot of your readers might not care too much about cyberpunk or know too much about it. So you have to provide that background information. Tag and synopsis are a part of that. Obviously, we've kind of talked about that already. Define your terms goes deep. It goes really, really deep, and you'll see I got a really good essay introduction coming up in this video that shows how you have to define your terms in your essays. Vague, abstract words and concepts like happiness, success, existentialism might mean X to you, but Y or nothing to someone else. What does happiness mean? Your definition of happiness might be completely different than mine's, or completely different than Macbeth's or Romeo's or Juliet's or Friar Lawrence's or something like that. So you have to define those terms early in your essay. It doesn't have to be in the introduction. It can be in body paragraph 1, but it has to be early. Approach is a little bit trickier, perhaps. What is your lens? Your teachers, if you're in grade 11 or 12 or in university, your teachers might have been talking about lenses, critical lenses, the way you approach it. There are different approaches to a poem, for example. You could approach it from a linguistic point of view. You might want to look at the syntax, or you might want to look at the word choice or the details of the sound devices. There's a lot of different ways you can approach a poem. You might want to look at it thematically. Most people probably approach it thematically. The theme of the poem is, the theme of the play is. Or if you're doing a poem, maybe images. Images are the first thing that a lot of people go to. So that's your approach. And in your introduction, you may want to do this. You don't have to, but you may want to indicate that I'm not going to look at A, B, and C. I'm not going to look at the linguistics. I'm not going to look at the rhythm or the meter. I'm going to look at the images. That's what I'm doing in this essay. So what is your lens? Will you examine the psychological aspects of character, the historical themes of the story, or the linguistic elements of a poem? Okay. So those are the basic strategies for your lead-in, and you can't avoid them. I don't think you can avoid them. I don't think I've seen a good literature introduction without some variation or some combination of these techniques. Mixing and matching, stretching them, squeezing them, but they're all in there, as you're going to see coming up soon. We're going to read these.